according to the government's own estimates, this deal will only add 0.08% onto the country's growth, and that's over around 10 years or so, and that's a lot less than the 4% hit we've had from Brexit, according to...
Yes, those figures aren't just the government's figures, they're my own department's figures, and I asked the exact same question, well, why are we doing this if this is just 0.08%?
Details of the potential upside. We don't know.
We know the potential.
So it's not 0 points. So what is it? 10%?
So you can't analyse it that way, Nick. I'm not going into a market and buying fish. You can look at the potential. If we don't use the deal properly, then the figures won't be good. If we use them well, they will be very good.
But what is very good? I mean, it's very good. Between 2 and 4%, between 4 and 6%.
Yes, but also remember, this depends on which countries join.
How is the CPTPP, the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, how is that actually going to affect growth?
What we are doing is looking at what the future is going to be like. So you'll have lots of people talking about, this is only 0.08%, similar to what you were saying about GDP figures. Think of it like us buying a startup. It's not about what it's doing today, but about the potential for growth tomorrow. And the CPTPP countries, about over 500 million people at the moment, and we're starting a trade relationship with them that's going to go into the future for many decades and deliver a lot of growth to the UK.
What about farmers? They might be worried. They felt that the trade deal that was done by the government with Australia and New Zealand meant that they had to compete with under what they might see as ruinous conditions. So do they have to be worried about this deal as well?
No, not at all. I would say that I think that the concerns about the previous deals were overblown, but I took that feedback when I was going into the negotiations. I'm an MP for a rural constituency. I speak to farmers all the time, and I had them at the back of my mind when we were carrying out these negotiations. So, for instance, on things like beef and pork, what we're talking about is 5% of domestic consumption. That's not going to displace farmers in the UK. And a lot of that is already coming from other countries in the EU. So actually, it's more competition for EU countries. And at the end of the day, people don't have to buy what they don't want. If I'm negotiating a trade deal, I'm thinking about my farmers in my country and what I can do for them.
There's a lot of people who look at these new GDP figures that are out this morning and say what they really reflect is the continuation of a long rut in which Britain has been stuck in an economic rut during 13 years that your party's been in power. Why do you think that's the case?
Why do I think that we've been in power for 13 years?
No, that's not the question. No. The question is...
I think that's because people trust Conservatives to run the country.
That's a great answer to a question that you asked yourself, which is not the question I asked.
So what about palm oil from Malaysia,
yes.
then, for example? Palm oil, obviously, is seen to be responsible for destroying habitats, being very bad for the environment. You're saying that there won't be lower tariffs on palm oil coming into this country?
There are. That's what happens. You have to make trade-offs. But we take in already just about 1%. I think it's actually slightly less than 1% of Malaysian palm oil exports. Moving the tariff from 2% to 0% is not what's going to cause deforestation. And actually, the standards which are set by this government, by the Department for the Environment, is what's going to dictate what comes into the country. But also, being in the trade bloc means that you're going to have more influence on sustainability. Palm oil is actually a great product. It's in so many of the things we use. This is not some illegal substance we're talking about. And actually, there are other crops in the EU that are causing deforestation that fit within EU rules. So we need to do what is right for our country.
There's a queue of countries. Some of them may join, some of them won't. So I can't speculate what happens if Ecuador and Costa Rica join, what happens if China joins. All of that could change the scope and the scale. So if what you're trying to get me on is it going to be 0.75 or is it going to be 7.5? I'm sorry, I'm just not going to play that game. Every time politicians come on these shows and give a figure, by the time they've left the room, the figure has changed. What I'm trying to explain is what it is we're doing and why it's important.
Have we
not
had to
arguing
pay?
About percentage figures. No, we haven't had to pay.
Okay.
It's not. So this is very different from being in the EU. There is no parliament. There is no commission. There's no regulating in that sense. There's no loss of sovereignty. So people often ask me, "Oh, this is going to be terrible for food standards." No, the food standards are going to be outlined by UK law. People have to meet that. What we're talking about is quotas. So this is more like what the European Economic Community, which we joined in the 70s, was, rather than a very integrated political union. This is not
you've
political
almost
union.
anticipated my question.
This is a trading. This is a trading bloc.
The thing I would want your viewers to understand is this is not to replace EU trade. It's in addition to EU trade. We have an EU FTA. Every day we're working to make it better, but we're also able to do more on the outside of the EU, and that's what this is about. So people should look at those projections in terms of buying a startup which is going to grow and become huge in the future. It's not about what it's making today, but about the potential, the synergies, and that's why it's really exciting.
But also, we do have trade deals with nearly all of these countries already, don't we? So how much difference can this make?
Because the what's in them is different. So the bilateral trade deals are different from a multilateral trade deal. You create synergies. It's the first time we've joined a bloc like this in about 50 years.
There have been two big recent shocks, haven't there? There's been the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. But what I was really referring to was 13 years in which there has been this sustained pattern. Let me just give you two specific instances of how Britain has fared over the last 13 years, and I'll just be interested in what you make of those. In the decade to 2007, British productivity growth was second only to America's in the G7. In the decade to 2019, growth in output per hour stalled to just 0.7% a year, making Britain the second slowest in the G7. Let me give you one other example. This translates economic numbers, which I know you deal with day in, day out, into real, felt human experience. After 13 years of your party being in power, life expectancy in this country is rising for rich people and falling for poor people. Can you think of a more severe indictment of your party's record in power than that?
Well, what I would say is that we have done and spent so much on things like the NHS and on education. Obviously, it is very disappointing when we see life expectancy falling in some cohorts. But I remember when I looked at, for instance, the issues on COVID disparities for ethnic minorities, did a long report on that. And there's a lot of complexity in terms of what feeds into health outcomes. But on productivity more generally, you are right. Productivity is something that we know has been falling.
To those who mourn the decision made as regards Britain's membership of the European Union, does this make up for it, in your view?
Well, it's not supposed to make up for it. It's in addition to the free trade agreement that we have with the EU. One of the things that happens now is that people talk as if we've put up a wall and we don't do anything with the EU at all. We are still trading and trading freely. Our exports, in particular on things like gas, have gone up. EU trade, depending on how you look at it, is doing well. It's increasing. I'm not saying that it's been easy for everybody. I'm not saying it has been perfect. There are, of course, consequences to leaving a bloc like that. But we are still working on our EU agreement. You look at things like the Windsor Framework. That's what having an independent trading policy is like. It's not a fixed thing. It's very dynamic. Every day we go to EU countries, I sign MOUs, we try and fix things that have become sticky. But in addition to that, we now have this new thing which we can add, and that's why it's fantastic. And it is one of the benefits of leaving the EU, having more of the opportunity to make our own way in the world.